I still remember the moment the first note trembled beneath my fingertips, how it bloomed into the vastness of the ballroom, like a fragile bird testing its wings, uncertain but defiant, how it swelled into something more than sound, something alive, something that belonged to no one but me. That was before the night split open, before the music died in my throat, before I saw him. The gala had been the kind of event that smelled of old money and quiet power. Women wrapped in silk like gifts never meant to be opened. Men with diamond cufflinks and smiles as sharp as their tailored suits. Crystal chandeliers that reflected everyone's beauty and no one's truth. I wasn't supposed to be there, not really. I was the entertainment, the background to their murmured deals and champagne laughter. A cello girl playing songs too soft for a world too hard. But that night, something in the air felt different. Charged. Like the moment before lightning decides to fall. The lights dimmed just enough for the spotlight to claim me, and I felt the hush roll over the crowd, 1,000 eyes turning toward the girl in the black dress. My bow trembled once, barely noticeable, before I drew it across the strings and let the first note pour out. I closed my eyes, as I always did when I wanted to disappear, when I wanted to become nothing but sound. The cello sang of loss and longing, of all the things I'd never had the courage to say aloud, and for a few minutes, the world seemed to hold its breath with me, until the gun went off. It was sharp and obscene, slicing through the music like a blade through silk. The bow fell from my hand. The last note quivered and died mid-air, hanging between terror and silence. For one suspended heartbeat, no one moved, as if disbelief itself had wrapped the room in glass. Then came the screams, the chaos, the shattering of crystal, the pounding of shoes against marble floors as people ran for their lives, and in the middle of it all, he stood, motionless, unflinching, a storm inside a tailored black suit. Our eyes met. That's how I remember it most clearly, not the sound of panic, not the smell of fear or gunpowder, but him. Tall, dark, still, his expression unreadable, his presence consuming everything around him. The world tilted, and I had the strange, dizzying thought that if I could just keep looking at him, maybe the chaos would make sense. He didn't look away. Not when the armed men rushed the exits. Not when one of them shouted his name. Moretti. Not even when a bullet shattered the crystal vase beside us, sending glass raining down like sharp little raindrops. Someone grabbed me from behind, dragging me toward the stage steps, but he was faster. In one smooth movement, he reached for me, his hand closing around my arm. Not rough, but absolute. The kind of grip that didn't ask permission. I should have screamed, should have fought, but I couldn't. His eyes were the color of ash and winter and regret. And there was something in them that made my pulse stutter. Something dangerous and broken and impossibly magnetic. He pulled me down behind one of the pillars as another round of gunfire echoed through the hall. His voice, low and controlled, brushed against my ear like smoke. "Stay down. Don't move." There was no time to ask who he was or why he was protecting me. All I knew was that my world, the safe, predictable one built on music and modesty, had just been rewritten in gunfire and shadows. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. He rose first, scanning the room like a predator checking for movement. Then he turned back to me, and for a long, unbearable second we just stared at each other. "You play," he said finally, his voice calm in a way that didn't fit the chaos. "Like you're bleeding." I didn't know what to say to that. My hands were shaking too hard to hold my bow. My dress was torn, and there was a smear of someone's blood. Maybe my own, on my wrist. He looked at me as though I was something fragile he didn't understand. Something he'd never meant to touch but couldn't stop himself from reaching for. "Who are you?" I whispered. A faint, ironic smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." Before I could ask more, men in black suits rushed in. His men, I realized, from the way they deferred to him, their eyes full of fear and obedience. They called him boss, and that word landed in the air like a verdict. He turned to leave, his presence cutting through the wreckage like a shadow too large to ignore. And just before disappearing through the shattered doors, he glanced back over his shoulder. "Don't come to events like this again," he said softly. "You don't belong in this world." And then he was gone. But he was wrong. Because after that night, his world became mine whether I wanted it or not. In the days that followed, I tried to forget him. I tried to lose myself in rehearsals, in the safe repetition of scales and melodies that didn't ask questions. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I saw that look, that impossible mix of sorrow and danger, as if he'd been born from the very darkness he was trying to escape. The newspapers called it a business rivalry turned violent. 5 dead, 3 wounded, no names released. But I knew. I knew the moment I read the words, "Organized crime suspected. Dante Moretti." That was the name whispered by the stagehands, the security guards, even the other musicians. Some said he was the head of the Moretti family, one of the most feared mafia syndicates on the East Coast. Others said he was the devil's right hand, that he'd taken power after killing his own brother. All I knew was that he'd looked at me, really looked at me, and that look had burned itself into the softest parts of me. I started noticing things after that. A black car parked too long across from my apartment, a bouquet of white lilies left outside my door with no note, a feeling that someone was always watching. My friends told me it was trauma, paranoia, that I should see a therapist. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks. It was him. He'd marked me somehow, tied me to a world I didn't understand but couldn't seem to escape. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself playing the same piece from that evening, the one that had made him stop and listen. I'd play until my fingers ached, until the bowstring frayed, until I could almost feel his gaze again. And when the last note faded, the silence that followed would feel too heavy, too knowing. It should have ended there. I should have let him stay as nothing more than a memory, a dangerous, fleeting shadow at the edge of my music. But fate has a cruel sense of humor, and some people are not meant to remain strangers. Because a week later, he came back. He came to my studio, in daylight, in a perfectly pressed suit, with eyes that held the same quiet fire. And when he said my name, it wasn't a question. It was a claim. And that's when everything I thought I knew about right and wrong, freedom and captivity, love and fear, began to unravel. Because when the devil falls in love with your music, he doesn't ask for an encore. He takes the whole song. I wish I could tell you that when he walked into my studio that afternoon, I didn't already know who he was, that I didn't feel that quiet, predatory presence long before the door even opened, that I didn't already taste that strange mixture of fear and curiosity that had been living in my mouth since the night of the gala. But the truth is, I felt him like a change in weather, like the moment the air thickens right before a storm, that trembling awareness that something unstoppable is about to break. I was sitting by the window, bow in hand, trying to convince myself that the music would save me from the memory of that night, that the sound of strings could wash away the sound of gunfire when the faintest shadow crossed the glass. And then he was there, standing in the doorway, as if he'd always belonged to every room he entered. He wore black again, of course he did, his suit perfectly tailored, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to make you wonder what kind of scars might hide beneath that fabric. His expression unreadable yet strangely softened by the sunlight that filtered through the window and rested against his face, catching the faint silver at his temples. "Hello, Ilara," he said, and my name in his mouth didn't sound like a greeting. It sounded like possession, like something he'd already decided was his. I set my cello down, the bow trembling between my fingers, and for a moment, All I could think about was how surreal it was that the man from the headlines, the man whose name made people lower their voices and lock their doors, was standing a few feet away from me, speaking as if we were old acquaintances rather than two people whose only shared memory was a room full of bodies and broken glass. "You shouldn't be here," I said finally, though my voice betrayed me, softer than I intended, uncertain. He smiled, faintly, almost sadly. "That's what I told you the night we met." "I remember," I murmured, and I hated how easily the words came out. How a part of me, some reckless, wounded part, was almost relieved to see him again, as if his presence somehow confirmed that what happened that night hadn't just been a nightmare I'd imagined. He took a slow step closer, his movements deliberate, graceful in a way that made me think of a predator pacing just outside the cage of its own restraint. "I came to apologize," he said, though his tone didn't sound apologetic at all. It sounded like a confession, heavy and reluctant. "You were caught in something that wasn't meant for you." I laughed then, not because anything about this was funny, but because that was the only sound that could keep me from shaking. "Caught in something? That's what you call it?" His gaze didn't waver. "You're angry." "I'm terrified," I whispered. The silence that followed stretched between us, taut and trembling, like the moment before a string snaps. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes moving over my face as if trying to memorize something fragile he didn't trust himself to touch. "You played through gunfire," he said quietly. "Most people would have run." "I didn't play through gunfire," I said. I froze. "No," he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "You fought. Your way was quieter, but it was still a fight." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. He reached into his coat then, and for one awful second my breath caught. But all he pulled out was an envelope. White, unmarked, folded once. "I want you to perform again," he said. "A private event." I stared at the envelope as though it might catch fire. "You want to hire me?" He didn't blink. "Yes." I shook my head. "No. Whatever this is, I'm not part of it." "Everyone's part of something," he murmured, "whether they want to be or not." There was a darkness in his tone that made the hairs on my arms rise. I wanted to tell him to leave, to walk out and never come back. But I couldn't seem to find the words. The way he looked at me, steady, unflinching, almost reverent, made it impossible to think clearly. It was like standing too close to a fire. It didn't matter that you knew it could burn you. The warmth still drew you closer. "I don't belong in your world," I said finally, and my voice cracked on the last word. He tilted his head slightly, studying me as though the concept of belonging was foreign to him. "And yet, you're already in it," he said, almost kindly. "The moment you played that first note, you were." I wanted to argue, but something about the way he said it, soft, inevitable, stilled me. He stepped closer, so close I could smell the faint trace of cologne and gunpowder that clung to him, a scent that should have repelled me but didn't. His voice dropped to a murmur, the kind that wrapped around you whether you wanted it to or not. "You have a gift, Alara," he said. "But gifts are dangerous things when the wrong people notice them. I can protect you." There it was, that quiet, terrible promise, the kind that doesn't offer safety, only ownership. "I don't need your protection," I said, though even as I said it, I could feel how hollow it sounded. He smiled again, and there was something almost tender in it, something that made me hate him and myself in equal measure. "Maybe not," he said, "but you'll have it anyway." He left the envelope on the piano and walked toward the door, his steps unhurried, his presence still filling every inch of the space even as he moved away. Just before he reached the exit, he paused and looked back. "You play like you're trying to break free," he said softly. I'm curious to see what happens when you stop trying." And then he was gone. The sound of the door closing felt final, like a lock sliding into place. I stood there for a long time, staring at the envelope, afraid to open it and more afraid not to. When I finally did, I found an invitation embossed in gold. No location, no details, just a time, a date, and a single sentence written in elegant, slanted handwriting. "For the woman who makes silence bleed." My hands trembled. I should have thrown it away, called the police, told someone, anyone, but I didn't. Because beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, something else was stirring, something reckless and alive, something that whispered that maybe, for once, I wanted to see what happened if I didn't walk away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by my window and watched the city breathe, the headlights and shadows weaving across the streets like restless spirits. Somewhere out there, he was watching too. I could feel it. A presence that didn't need sight to be known. I thought about his voice, about the strange sadness that clung to him like an invisible wound, about the way he'd looked at me not as a stranger but as someone he already understood. By the time dawn began to bleed across the sky, pale and exhausted, I had made a decision that would ruin everything I thought I knew about safety, about morality, about myself. I would go. Not because I trusted him, but because I needed to know why he had chosen me. And as I sat there, tracing the edge of that invitation with my fingertips, a thought crept into my mind that I couldn't silence. What if the danger wasn't in the man himself, but in the way he made me want to see him again? I told myself it was just one performance, one night, one answer to a question I didn't yet understand. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Once you've looked the devil in the eye and seen something human staring back, you can never look away again. I told myself I wasn't going to go, that I would throw the invitation into the trash and forget the entire thing, that I would return to my quiet life of lessons and practice and small, predictable days that belonged only to me. But the truth is that the moment I read that sentence, "For the woman who makes silence bleed," something inside me shifted. Something deep and wordless that had been sleeping for too long. Something that whispered that no matter how much I wanted to pretend I didn't care, I was already caught in his orbit, and there was no walking away without finding out how close I could get before burning. The night of the performance came too quickly, as nights you dread always do, slipping through the cracks of your resolve until you realize it's too late to turn back. I wore black again, a simple dress that clung to my ribs and made me feel invisible and exposed all at once, my cello case heavy in my hand, like a secret I wasn't ready to share. The address had been sent that morning, a location outside the city, the kind of place that didn't exist on maps but on whispers, Moretti Estate. The car that came for me was unmarked, sleek and silent, its driver expressionless. I didn't ask questions and he didn't offer answers. As the city lights thinned and the road turned to gravel, I felt something tighten inside my chest. That old familiar fear mingled with something far more dangerous, anticipation. The estate appeared out of the darkness like a mirage, sprawling and ancient, its windows glowing faintly as if the house itself were alive and watching. The gates opened without a sound, and when we stopped, I could already see him waiting on the steps. Dante Moretti looked different in the soft wash of the moonlight, less a shadow, more a man, though still too composed, too deliberate, like someone who had spent his life controlling every gesture until control itself became a language. He was wearing black again, he always did, and his hands were tucked in his pockets, his posture deceptively relaxed. But his eyes, those cold, storm-colored eyes, tracked every movement I made as though I were both guest and trespasser in his world. "Ilara," he said when I stepped out of the car, and the sound of my name in his voice sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I wasn't sure you'd come. Neither was I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise. He smiled faintly, a curve of lips that carried no warmth but some strange, quiet satisfaction. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, he said, and I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a confession. The house was breathtaking in the way old things are, full of ghosts and expensive silences, its walls lined with oil paintings that stared down with the kind of solemn disapproval only money and history could buy. He led me through hallways that seemed to stretch forever, the click of my heels echoing like a heartbeat, until we reached a small salon lit by candles and the faint gleam of a grand piano in the corner. I thought you preferred the cello, I said softly, because I didn't know what else to say, and the quiet was beginning to feel too intimate. I prefer whatever makes you play, he said, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. A few other men were there, silent, watchful, the kind of men who looked like they could kill with their hands and sleep soundly afterward. They didn't speak to me or to each other, and their eyes never left Dante, as though his slightest movement dictated their every breath. He gestured toward the small stage near the window where a single chair and music stand had been placed, and I understood without being told that this was not a performance for a crowd, but for him alone. I sat, drew the bow across the strings, and began to play. The room filled with sound, slow and mournful, the kind of melody that unravels rather than begins. And as I played, I felt his gaze settle on me like a physical touch, heavy and unrelenting. Not cruel exactly, but consuming. I wanted to hate it. The way he looked at me as if the music belonged to him, as if every note I created was something he'd earned the right to hear. But some part of me, some traitorous, trembling part, wanted him to keep looking, wanted him to understand what it meant to lose yourself in sound and find pieces of your soul you didn't know were missing. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt alive, charged, as if the air itself were waiting. He didn't clap. He didn't need to. He stood slowly, crossed the space between us, and said in a voice so low it barely reached me, "Do you know what that piece reminds me of?" I shook my head, unable to speak. "Grief," he said simply, "the kind that never leaves." Something in his tone made me look up, and for the first time I saw it. The faint crack in the armor, the glimmer of something raw and human beneath all that control. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but I had seen it, and he knew I had. He sat down across from me, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze steady. "You remind me of someone," he said after a moment, and though I already knew where this conversation was going, I couldn't stop myself from asking. "Your wife," I said quietly. His jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath the smooth veneer of composure. "Is that what they told you?" I hesitated. "It's what I heard." He nodded once, as if that confirmed something for him, and then leaned back, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "She played too," he said, his voice distant. "The piano. She was kind. Too kind for this life." I wanted to ask what happened, but the question died on my tongue when I saw the shadow pass over his face. Whatever the story was, it was a wound, and I didn't yet have the right to touch it. After a long silence, he said, "I have an offer for you." The way he said it made my stomach twist. "What kind of offer?" "I want you to stay," he said simply. "Here, at the estate. Perform for me. Play when I ask, for as long as I ask." I stared at him, stunned. "You want me to live here?" "Yes." "Why?" He smiled, but there was nothing gentle in it. "Because your music does something I can't explain. It silences the noise in my head, and because I want to see what happens when you play without fear." I stood up, heart pounding. "That's not an offer," I said. That's imprisonment. He rose too, not in anger but in quiet inevitability, as though he'd expected that response. No, he said softly. It's protection. You just don't see from what yet. I wanted to argue, to tell him I didn't need him, that his world and mine were galaxies apart. But the way he looked at me, like he already knew how the story would end, stole the words before they could form. Think about it, he said, stepping back. You have until tomorrow. He left me standing there with the faint scent of smoke and rain lingering in the air, the echoes of my own music still trembling against the walls, and for a long time I couldn't move. When the car drove me back to the city, the road stretched endlessly before me. But no matter how far we went, it felt like I was still inside his world, still hearing his voice in the back of my mind. By the time I reached my apartment, dawn was breaking again, pale and uncertain, and I realized that his presence had already seeped into my life like a slow, spreading stain. Because even though I told myself I wouldn't, I knew I would say yes. Not because I wanted to, but because part of me already belonged to him. And the rest, he would take soon enough. It's strange, the way a house begins to feel like it's breathing once you've spent enough time listening to its silences, the way every hallway seems to whisper when the night stretches too long, the way even the air feels heavier, as if carrying the memories of everyone who has ever walked through its doors. And in the Moretti estate, those whispers felt louder than anywhere I had ever been, full of secrets I wasn't meant to hear, and ghosts I wasn't meant to meet. I moved in 3 days after that night, against all logic, against every instinct that told me to run. But logic has never been a match for curiosity, and curiosity has never been a match for loneliness. And perhaps that was what he understood about me long before I understood it myself. The day I arrived, Dante was waiting in the grand foyer, dressed, as always, in black, a dark shape against the pale marble and flickering candlelight. He didn't smile, didn't welcome me, didn't pretend that this arrangement was something ordinary. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging that the inevitable had finally happened. Your room is upstairs, he said, his voice calm but distant. You'll find everything you need. Dinner is at 8. You're free to play whenever you wish. Free. It was a beautiful word, but in his mouth it sounded like a lie. The housekeeper, an older woman named Lucia, showed me to my room, a high-ceilinged chamber with tall windows that looked out onto the gardens, a grand piano in one corner, and a cello already waiting for me by the window. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. And yet there was something about the air that felt untouched, almost sacred, like no one had truly lived here in a long time. That night, as I unpacked my clothes and tried to make the room feel less like a stranger's memory, I noticed a faint scent of jasmine drifting through the window, delicate and haunting. It seemed to follow me for days, even when the windows were shut, and I began to wonder if it was perfume or something less tangible, some echo of someone who'd once stood where I stood now. Dante didn't seek me out, not at first. I would see him in passing sometimes, in the corridor late at night, his expression unreadable, or in the library surrounded by books and silence. He always seemed to exist half in shadow, as though light itself hesitated before touching him. The staff spoke of him in quiet tones, never quite meeting my eyes when I asked questions. The word boss floated in the air like an invisible title no one dared to speak aloud. It was on the 4th night that I found the music room. I hadn't been exploring intentionally, but the house had a way of leading you places, as if it wanted to show you something you weren't ready to see. The door was half open, and inside I could see a grand piano beneath a veil of dust, its lid slightly ajar, a single candle burning low on the windowsill. Someone had been there recently. I stepped closer, drawn by that same faint jasmine scent that had begun to feel like a presence of its own. There was a photograph on the piano, a woman with dark hair and soft eyes, her smile fragile but real. She looked a little like me, enough that for a moment my stomach twisted. I touched the edge of the frame, tracing her face with my fingertips, and whispered before I could stop myself, "Is this you?" She was my wife. His voice came from behind me, low and steady, and I turned, startled, my heart leaping in my chest. Dante stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his eyes unreadable in the dim light. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to—" He shook his head. "It's all right. You were bound to find her eventually." There was something in the way he said it, soft, resigned, almost tender, that made me ache. I looked back at the photograph. "She's beautiful." "She was," he said simply, stepping into the room. "Her name was Isabella." I waited, sensing that there was more, that he was teetering on the edge of something he rarely allowed himself to say. "What happened to her?" He looked at me for a long time, the kind of look that makes you forget where you are, that makes you feel both seen and stripped bare. "She died," he said finally, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight that made my throat tighten. "How?" I asked softly, and immediately wished I hadn't. He turned away, walked toward the window, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of moonlight. "Because of me," he said, barely above a whisper. "Because of this life." The silence that followed felt almost sacred. I didn't know what to say, and maybe he didn't expect me to. He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, before finally speaking again. "She played the piano," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that didn't belong to the man who commanded armies and fear. "She said music was the only thing that made her forget who I was. When she played, I could almost believe we were normal. I used to sit right there," he gestured to the chair across from the piano, "and watch her hands move. It was the only time I felt peace." I swallowed hard, my eyes burning. "You loved her." He turned to me, and there was a strange, unguarded honesty in his expression. "I still do." The words hit me like a confession and a warning all at once. For the first time, I realized that whatever tether bound him to me was not born of affection or desire. It was born of loss. I wasn't a Lara to him. I was the echo of a woman who no longer existed. "She looks like me," I said before I could stop myself. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "But you play differently." I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a curse. After that night, the ghost of Isabella seemed to follow me everywhere. I would find traces of her in the smallest places, in the faint indentation of a handprint on the banister, in a music sheet left open to a song I didn't recognize, in the garden where her favorite flowers still bloomed despite the season. The house was hers, every corner haunted by her absence, and though Dante never mentioned her again, I could feel her between us like a shadow neither of us could banish. Yet something began to shift. He started appearing more often while I played, standing silently near the doorway, his presence steady but never intrusive, his gaze unreadable. Sometimes I would feel his eyes on me and falter, and sometimes, when the music swelled, I would almost forget he was there. It was in those moments that I sensed something changing in him, something dangerous and alive, an emotion trying to claw its way through years of restraint. One night, as I finished a piece and set down my bow, I heard him say softly, almost to himself, "You're not her." I turned, heart pounding, unsure if I was meant to answer. "I know." He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking until I could feel the faint warmth of his breath. "That's why I can't stop listening." There was something terrifying in the way he said it, something that felt like both confession and surrender. And though I wanted to step back, to remind him that this was a line that should never be crossed. I couldn't move. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and in that silence I realized how thin the thread had become between what I feared and what I wanted. When he finally turned and walked away, I was left standing in the dim glow of candlelight, the air still trembling with the sound of the music that had bound us together. And for the first time, I understood the truth that frightened me most of all. The ghost of his wife wasn't just haunting him anymore. She was haunting me. It's strange how quickly a house full of ghosts can start to feel like a home. How the silence that once pressed against your ribs like a weight begins to sound like comfort. How footsteps that once startled you begin to feel familiar. How a man whose name once only conjured whispers of danger can start to look like the only person who truly sees you. And yet, even as I tell myself these things, I can feel something shifting beneath the surface. A quiet dread curling at the edge of my thoughts, because nothing about Dante Moretti's world is safe. And love, if that's what this is the sharpest weapon of all. After that night in the music room, something between us changed, though neither of us spoke of it. He didn't touch me, didn't even try, but there was a new current between us, a wordless awareness that hummed through the air whenever we were near each other, as if every glance, every shared silence, carried the weight of everything we refused to say aloud. I would play the cello and feel his gaze on me like a hand that hovered just above my skin, never quite touching, but burning all the same. And in the quiet between notes, I would hear his breathing, steady, restrained, controlled to the point of breaking. The house itself seemed to react to it. The candles flickered longer, the halls stayed warmer at night, and Lucia, who had always moved through the corridors like a shadow, began watching me with eyes that seemed to know far more than they should. One morning, as she poured coffee for me in the kitchen, she said softly, "Be careful, Bella. The last woman who tried to heal his heart forgot that he doesn't know how to give it back once it's taken." Her words lingered in my mind all day, clinging like smoke I couldn't wash off. But by the time the sun set, Dante's voice calling my name from down the hall scattered every coherent thought I'd tried to hold on to. He stood in the library when I entered, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The firelight painted him in shades of amber and gold, making him look almost human, almost fragile, though I knew better than to believe that illusion. "I need your help," he said simply, his tone calm but edged with something unspoken. "With what?" I asked, cautious but curious. He hesitated for a moment, then set the glass down and turned to face me fully. "There's a gala tomorrow night. For the foundation my family funds. You'll play." I blinked, surprised. "You want me to perform?" "Yes," he said, moving closer. "It's a public event. Reporters, business partners, politicians, and enemies. Everyone will be watching. I need them distracted. I need them to believe that nothing in my world is falling apart." I frowned, unsure if I should feel honored or used. "So I'm your distraction." "You're my music," he corrected. And though the words were soft, they landed like a command. I should have said no. I should have told him that I wasn't a pawn in his game, that I refused to be part of whatever dark dance his world demanded. But something in his eyes, something fragile and almost pleading, held me still. I nodded instead, though a quiet chill slipped through me as I realized that agreeing to play for him meant stepping fully into his world. No longer an observer, but a participant in whatever this dangerous story was becoming. The next day passed in a blur of preparations. Lucia brought dresses to my room, silks and satins in deep shades of red and black, and I chose one that seemed to belong to someone far braver than I was. A crimson gown, with a low back and delicate lace sleeves that clung to my skin like a secret. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. No longer the quiet cellist who had once busked on street corners, but someone caught in a dangerous kind of beauty, a living reflection of the man whose world she had stumbled into. When Dante came to escort me that evening, he didn't speak at first. His gaze swept over me slowly, deliberately, his jaw tightening slightly as though he was fighting to maintain composure. "You look—" He paused, then said quietly, "Like trouble." "Maybe I am," I said before I could stop myself, and the corner of his mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close enough to make my pulse quicken. The gala was held in the ballroom of a grand hotel in the heart of the city, the kind of place that gleamed with marble floors, chandeliers, and the illusion of civility. Dante's presence commanded the room the moment we entered. Conversations faltered, eyes turned, and I felt the unspoken tension ripple through the crowd like static. Everyone seemed to know who he was, and no one dared to say his name too loudly. He led me to the stage where my cello waited, perfectly tuned, its polished surface reflecting the golden light above. "Play something they won't forget," he murmured near my ear. And though his voice was calm, I could feel the storm beneath it, the quiet desperation of a man who needed beauty to hide his chaos. I played. The first note shivered through the air like a sigh, and as I lost myself in the music, the rest of the world began to blur. I played not for the audience, not even for him, but for the ache that lived between us, the grief of his dead wife, the confusion of my own heart, the fragile thread that bound us in ways neither of us understood. My bow danced across the strings, and the sound that filled the room was not sweet, but haunting. A melody born of longing and loss, the kind of music that tastes like memory. When I finished, the applause was thunderous, but I hardly heard it. Dante's eyes found mine across the room, and for a single heartbeat it felt as if we were the only two people alive. But then, the illusion shattered. A man approached him, a tall, thin figure in a gray suit with a scar running down his left cheek, and I watched the easy calm drain from Dante's face, replaced by something cold and deadly. They spoke quietly, too quietly for me to hear, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened, the flash of warning in his eyes when he turned toward me as if to say, "Don't move." Moments later, chaos erupted. A glass shattered somewhere behind me. People screamed, and Dante was already moving, his hand at his side, his body a blur of precision and violence. I didn't see the gun, not at first, but I heard it. The sharp crack that split the music in half. The echo that sent my heart pounding in my throat. Dante's men swarmed instantly, pulling him toward the exit, and before I could even catch my breath, he was there beside me, his hand gripping my wrist hard enough to bruise. "Come with me," he said, voice low but urgent, his eyes dark with fury. "Now." I didn't argue. I couldn't. He pulled me through a back hallway, past startled servers and terrified guests, until we burst through a side door into the cold night air. The sirens had already begun to wail in the distance, and in that moment, standing beneath the city lights, with his hand still wrapped around mine, I realized I had just crossed a line I could never return from. He looked at me, breathing hard, a cut bleeding along his temple. "You shouldn't have been there," he said, his voice rough. "You asked me to play," I whispered, my throat dry. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his face softening just slightly. "And now," he said, "you're part of my world whether you wanted to be or not." His words sank into me like a blade, cold, certain, irreversible, and though I didn't yet know what kind of deal I had just made, I knew it had already cost me something I would never get back. The storm had been coming all afternoon, but I didn't notice it until the first fat drops of rain began hammering against the tall windows of the music room, their rhythmic patter blending with the soft, sorrowful hum of my cello. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and electricity, the kind of storm that made everything inside feel smaller and more fragile. And somehow, Despite the tension that had been building between us over weeks that felt like years, the world outside seemed to shrink until there was only me, the music, and Dante Moretti watching from the shadows like a man who had stepped out of some dangerous dream and refused to leave. I was sitting on the edge of the worn wooden chair, bow in hand, my fingers trembling not from the chill, but from the electricity I could feel radiating from him. A silent, unyielding pull that made my pulse thrum in ways I hadn't known I was capable of. And though I tried to tell myself that I was playing for the sound alone, for the notes, for the music that had always been my refuge, I knew deep down that every vibration that left the strings carried a piece of me meant only for him. He was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, his dark suit clinging to his broad frame, sleeves rolled to the elbows as he often did when he wasn't performing the facade of untouchable control. And yet there was something in the way he watched me that made the air between us tremble. Something fragile and dangerous that was never there when others looked on. Something that made me want to close the door, lock it, and let him see nothing at all. But that was impossible because we had already been pulled too far into each other's gravity to stop. The piece I played was new, one I had been writing in secret. Notes flowing from my heart in long, jagged lines that felt like the ache of a body learning to remember what it means to feel. And I could sense him leaning slightly forward, as if even the air couldn't exist between us without touching him. And I realized that in all my life, I had never had anyone listen like this. Not with this intensity, not with this silence, and it was terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. When the final note quivered into nothing, lingering in the dampened light like smoke, I dropped my bow and dared to look at him fully, expecting the controlled, distant expression he usually wore, the armor that kept everyone at bay. But instead I saw something else, something that made my knees ache, something that made the blood in my veins run hot and desperate. An unspoken confession hiding in the storm of his dark eyes. An acknowledgement that he had been holding back for weeks. Months, perhaps. And that whatever restraint he had clung to had finally begun to crumble. "You play like you bleed," he said softly, his voice rough, almost raw, and the words landed against me like an accusation and a benediction all at once, leaving me trembling in ways I didn't understand. I'm just playing," I whispered, though I knew it was a lie, though I could feel in my bones that every note, every tremor of the strings had been meant for him from the beginning. "No," he said, stepping closer, and the scent of him, cologne, leather, smoke, something entirely his own, washed over me, making it impossible to think, impossible to breathe, impossible to resist. "It's never just playing with you." I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the cello for balance, though it offered no real stability, because the room had shrunk until it felt like we were the only two people alive. And in that silence, I realized something I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself. I wanted him. I wanted the danger, the intensity, the fire that seemed to consume everything he touched and everything he looked at. And more than anything, I wanted to know what it felt like to be seen like this, completely and utterly, by someone who was as dangerous as he was intoxicating. He moved again, closer this time, so close that I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible quiver of his jaw, the raw edge of something vulnerable hidden beneath the mask of control. And I wanted to step back, to tell him that this was impossible, that the world he lived in and the world I had tried to cling to were separated by too many rules and too much blood. But my body refused, rooted to the floor by the pull between us, and even my breath seemed stolen by anticipation. And then, almost without warning, he was there, his hands framing my face with a tenderness that seemed almost obscene given everything I knew about him, the way he had killed, the way he had commanded fear and loyalty. And yet here he was, and I could feel the weight of all that unspoken grief, all that loss, all that darkness pressing against me, and I understood in that moment that it wasn't control he wanted from me, not exactly, but surrender, in its purest, most terrifying form. Our lips met then, not soft, not tentative, but hard and claiming. A collision that stole my breath, set my heart racing, and left the room spinning around us like the eye of a hurricane. And I kissed him back. Because how could I not? Because the music had led us here. Because the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that had been building between us since the first night I had met him. Since the first gunshot that had shattered everything I thought I knew about safety and desire. He tasted of whiskey and rain and something darker, something feral, and the sound he made, low, almost strangled, like he was giving a piece of himself he had never given before, shook me to my core. And when he pulled back slightly, just enough to look at me, his eyes glimmered with a storm I couldn't name, and for the first time I realized that beneath the danger, beneath the violence, beneath the reputation that made men bow and women whisper, there was something broken in him, something human. And that break was the reason I could never leave him, even if I wanted to. I pressed my forehead against his, trying to catch my breath, trying to remember that there was still a world outside this room, a world where people lived normal lives. But all I could hear was the rhythm of his heartbeat, the echo of my own, the patter of rain against the windows. And I knew, without question, that the line had been crossed, that something had begun between us that could not be undone, that whatever came next, whatever darkness awaited in his world, we were tangled now in a way that neither of us could escape. "You shouldn't have done that," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I meant the kiss or the way he made me feel, the way he made me want him, the way he made the world shrink until there was nothing but us and the music and the storm. "And yet," he murmured, his forehead still pressed to mine, I couldn't stop myself. The words settled over me like smoke, suffocating and intoxicating all at once, and I realized then that he was not like anyone I had ever known, not like anyone I had ever wanted, not like anyone I should ever allow myself to want. And yet the pull between us was undeniable, unstoppable, a force of nature that neither my mind nor my heart could resist. We stood like that for a long time, breathing each other in until the storm outside began to fade, the rain softening to a drizzle, the thunder rolling away into the distance, and I knew that the world was waiting beyond those windows, with its rules and consequences and danger, and that when we finally stepped apart, nothing could ever be the same. And yet, even as the music room emptied of sound, even as the storm passed into night, even as the quiet settled around us like a fragile truce, I understood something terrifyingly simple. The first kiss was not the end, it was the beginning. Because when Dante Moretti falls in love with you, there is no safety, no turning back, only the next step into a world that is as dark as it is beautiful, and the only question that remains is whether you are willing to follow. The first time I realized just how fragile the illusion of control could be in Dante's world, I was already standing too close, my fingers still trembling from the memory of his lips on mine, the storm that had raged between us in that music room echoing long after the rain had stopped. And I thought, for a fleeting, foolish moment, that maybe the storm inside him had calmed for me, that maybe the darkness could bend, could soften, could yield just enough to let me exist safely beside him. And then I saw the message, and everything I believed about love and loyalty shattered into 1,000 pieces sharper than broken glass. It was left in the study, folded neatly atop the mahogany desk, the kind of envelope that seemed too formal, too deliberate to be accidental, and the handwriting made my pulse seize. Precise, elegant, unmistakably deliberate. My name, written across it, made my skin prickle, and even before I opened it, I knew that it wasn't meant to comfort me. It was meant to destroy me. I hesitated. For several minutes, I traced the edges with my fingertips, willing myself to put it aside, to walk out and pretend it didn't exist. But there is a certain gravity in Dante's world, a pull that even the smallest gesture carries. And when I finally unfolded the letter, my blood ran cold. It was from someone I thought I could trust, a name that had surfaced in whispered conversations, a man who had been loyal to Dante for years, a man who had once smiled at me with warmth. And the words were precise, calculated, venomous. She is too close. She knows too much. Remove her before she becomes a problem. You know what to do. The ink seemed to burn on the paper, a silent scream meant for my eyes alone, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me as the implications settled, crushing me under their weight. I knew instantly that this was not just a warning, not just a threat. It was a plan. And somehow, despite all my precautions, I had already become the target. I ran to find him, to tear into his chest and demand answers, and when I did, he was in the music room, the same place where the first kiss had set fire to everything between us, standing with his hands in his pockets, eyes closed, as if he could somehow will the world into stillness with his presence. "Dante," I breathed, my voice trembling, the envelope clutched in my hand like a weapon. Someone wants to hurt me." His eyes opened slowly, and in that moment, I saw the shift, the subtle change in him that I had never seen before, the tension coiling beneath his skin, the dark storm behind his calm exterior that no one, not even me, was allowed to see until now. "Who?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous, the kind of tone that makes the air itself shiver. I handed him the letter, my fingers slick with sweat, and watched as he read, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with a fury I had never dared to imagine. When he looked up, the man before me was no longer Dante Moretti the Enigma, the storm contained in a perfect suit. He was Dante Moretti the Predator, and I was suddenly very aware of the danger of standing in his presence. "They think I don't know," he muttered, almost to himself, pacing the floor with long, deliberate strides that made my stomach twist. "They think I can't see them, but everything in this world, every shadow, every whisper, every betrayal is visible to me if I want it to be." "Then why didn't you protect me?" I asked, my voice shaking, the first real crack in the armor I had built around myself. He stopped, turning to me, and there was a flicker of something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or pain, before the wall returned, unbroken and cold. "I can't protect you from everyone," he said quietly, almost too quietly, and the words struck me harder than any bullet could. "Some people in my world, they believe in rules I cannot bend. Some of them, they would rather see you gone than safe. And He broke off, ran a hand through his hair, and the raw frustration etched in his expression made my heart ache. "I would die for you, Ilara, but I cannot stop what others decide to do. You must understand that before it's too late." The storm outside had returned, wind rattling the windows, rain lashing against the panes. But it was nothing compared to the tempest that tore through me at that moment. The knowledge that I was not only a pawn in his world, but that the people closest to him could see me as nothing more than a threat, a complication, a problem to be eliminated. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave and never look back. I wanted to take my music, my life, my fragile heart, and disappear before it was too late. But then I looked at him, standing there like a man who had already decided to sacrifice the world to keep me alive, and I realized that leaving was no longer an option. The thread that connected us, fragile as it was, had become unbreakable, and the danger only made it more intoxicating, more impossible to resist. He stepped closer, and I could feel the heat of him even through the wet chill that had seeped in from the storm outside. "You must trust me," he said, and there was no pleading in his voice, only a command that left no room for argument. Because if you don't, you won't survive what's coming. And I cannot survive losing you. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand that he explain how deep the betrayal went, wanted to know whose hand was already in motion, whose eyes were watching, whose decisions would ripple into violence I could not imagine. But I couldn't find my voice. The fear and desire and helplessness all tangled together inside me, making every thought, every plan, every instinct crumble. He reached out then, his hand brushing against mine, and the contact was electric, sharp, as though the world had condensed into a single moment of heat and desperation. "I will fix this," he whispered, his lips almost grazing my ear. "I will make them pay. I will make sure you are safe. But you have to stay close, Ilara. You cannot leave. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until I say it's safe." And as I stood there, trapped between fear and fascination, between the desire to trust him and the instinct to run, I realized with a sickening clarity that the betrayal had already changed everything. Nothing would ever be the same again. Not our music, not our fragile moments of tenderness, not the quiet life I had imagined for myself, not the pulse of normality I had once clung to. The letter, now crumpled in my hand, seemed almost alive, a reminder that in Dante's world, danger was not distant or abstract. It was intimate, immediate, a shadow that could touch me at any moment, and yet I felt a pull so strong I could not resist it. A force that drew me closer to him even as my mind screamed to flee, because part of me understood something terrifying and inevitable. To love Dante Moretti was to walk willingly into the fire, to feel the heat against your skin and crave it, even when you knew it could consume you entirely. He stood closer now, the storm raging outside echoing the one building between us, and when he leaned down to whisper against my hair, "No one will touch you while I breathe," I believed him, not because the words were empty, but because I could feel in every line of his body, in every shadow in his eyes, that he meant it, that he would kill and destroy and burn the world if it meant keeping me safe. And I also understood that even that might not be enough. And as the rain pelted the windows, and the wind tore through the trees surrounding the estate, I realized that the betrayal had set us on a path we could never turn from, that the danger had not diminished, but only grown sharper, and that whatever awaited us in the days to come would demand everything of me. My courage, my heart, my music, my very soul. And there would be no turning back. Because in Dante Moretti's world, love is never safe, trust is always a gamble, and the price for desire is often measured in blood. The city had a way of breathing in darkness, of swallowing secrets whole, of hiding violence behind the glittering facade of streetlights and late-night laughter. And as Dante drove me through its slick streets that night, the rain streaking the windshield like fractured glass, I felt that darkness pressing against me, as if it knew I was intruding into a world where the rules were written in blood and fear. A world that did not forgive hesitation or weakness. A world that would consume me if I allowed even the tiniest fragment of doubt to take root. He didn't speak much, only occasionally murmuring my name to check if I was still awake, still with him. And every time he did, I felt that familiar shiver of fear and something else, something deeper, something I was starting to recognize as the dangerous pull of desire. Because when Dante Moretti speaks your name, it's no longer just a name, it becomes an ownership, a promise, a warning, a pulse that threads through your veins and binds you to him, whether you want it or not. We arrived at an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that reeked of rust and smoke, of sweat and anger, of decisions that had already been made without mercy, and I followed him through the shadows, my heart hammering in my chest, because I knew that every step into this place was a step deeper into a world I had once only glimpsed in headlines and whispers, a world where power was absolute and loyalty was currency. And I realized that tonight, I was no longer a bystander. I was part of it. Inside, the warehouse was alive with movement, men and women whose expressions were sharp, hard, accustomed to violence, to obedience, to the constant threat of death. And they paused only briefly as Dante entered, their eyes flicking to him with a mixture of fear and respect, a silent acknowledgement that he was the one who decided who lived and who died in this world, and that I, by extension, was under his protection or his wrath, though neither was something I could take lightly. "Who is she?" a man asked, stepping forward, his voice steady but edged with curiosity, and Dante's eyes, dark and unflinching, cut across the room like a blade. "She's the one who plays," Dante said, his tone measured, calm, but carrying the weight of command that made everyone freeze. "The one I trust to see the truth in music and in people. The one I will protect, no matter the cost." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the words settle over me like a shroud, and though I had never been trained for this, had never thought to navigate the labyrinth of Mafia loyalties and vendettas, I understood instinctively that my life had shifted irreversibly, that tonight would mark the moment when music became survival, when passion became power, and when trust became a gamble measured in blood. Dante moved past me, his hand brushing mine briefly, a silent reassurance, and I felt it like fire through my veins, a tether of intimacy and danger that reminded me that in his world, the line between love and destruction was thinner than a hair, and that crossing it once meant you could never step back. He approached a man at the far end of the room, someone I recognized from earlier whispers, the scarred figure who had sent the letter, and I felt my stomach tighten. This was the betrayal made flesh, the threat materialized, the reminder that nothing in Dante's life was distant or abstract. Everything was immediate, and anyone who challenged him or crossed his path paid a price. "Explain yourself," Dante said, his voice low, measured, deadly, and the man flinched under the weight of it, as if the air itself had hardened into steel. "Why send the letter?" The man's eyes flicked to me, then back to Dante, and I realized with a pang that my presence was a weapon, a leverage, a fragile piece of a deadly game. I was only following orders," he stammered. You thought wrong," Dante interrupted sharply, stepping closer, his shadow stretching over the man like a threat in flesh, and I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, the control barely contained, the storm ready to erupt. "Orders meant nothing when it comes to her. Do you understand?" The man nodded, sweat glistening on his forehead, and I could see that fear, the same fear I had felt the night I first met him, was something Dante wielded like a weapon. Precise, merciless, inevitable. But there was something more too. Something I couldn't name, a current of justice or vengeance or something older than either of us. A reminder that in his world, loyalty was bought with blood and betrayal was the currency of death. He turned then, his eyes finding mine across the room, and I felt that pull again. The dangerous, intoxicating connection that made me ache and tremble and want, and I knew in that moment that I was no longer safe in the abstract sense, that safety was not a shield I could hold, but a promise he would enforce with every ounce of his being, and that the world outside could threaten me, could strike, could bite. But Dante Moretti would strike harder, bite harder, and burn everything in his path before he let anyone harm me. He nodded to the scarred man, a single, deliberate gesture, and I watched as the man dropped to his knees, a silent surrender, the acknowledgement that Dante's vengeance was precise, inexorable, unstoppable, and I realized then that the word enemy had a new meaning in this world. Anyone who opposed him, anyone who touched me, anyone who dared interfere with his life, became disposable, and I had seen it firsthand, and the knowledge made my heart race with both fear and awe. Then Dante approached me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders, and I felt the warmth, the fire, the quiet dominance that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "You understand now," he said softly, the storm in his eyes echoing the one outside. That when you're with me, there is no halfway. There is no safety in the ordinary. There is only what we fight for together, and what I will protect with everything I have, even if it destroys the world around us. I nodded, trembling, because I did understand, even if my mind refused to accept it fully. I understood that I had crossed the line into a world I could not leave, that the first kiss, the stolen glances, the whispered confessions had brought me here, to this moment where trust and danger were inseparable, and that love with Dante Moretti was always a gamble, a peril, a fire that could consume or purify depending on how carefully it was wielded. The rain outside softened, but the air inside the warehouse still hummed with tension, with unspoken threats, with the promise of vengeance that was yet to be unleashed, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that the night was far from over, that the storm between us and the world outside had only just begun, and that whatever came next would demand more of me than I had ever given, more than I could imagine, more than I thought I could survive. And as Dante led me back toward the car, his hand brushing mine with that same incendiary touch, I realized that the world I had once clung to, the safe, ordinary life of music and quiet evenings and fragile dreams, was gone forever, replaced by a life of fire and blood and desire, where betrayal could strike at any moment and vengeance would follow, unrelenting, like a shadow I could never outrun. Because in his world, there was no forgiveness for betrayal, and there was no safety for anyone he loved. And I had already learned the most dangerous truth of all. That loving Dante Moretti meant stepping into the storm with open eyes, knowing that the storm could break you at any second, and yet never wanting to leave. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of my room, pale and hesitant, like it wasn't sure it wanted to illuminate the chaos that had become my life. And for a long moment I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my fingers curled around the sheets, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of the storm that Dante had dragged me into, trying to reconcile the dangerous allure of his presence with the fear that had been clawing at me since the warehouse, because the truth was undeniable. I was in over my head, and there was no one to rescue me except him, and even he might not be enough. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind like a film I couldn't pause or fast forward. The scarred man on his knees, the tension crackling in the warehouse like static. Dante's hands on my shoulders, the fire in his eyes that burned with vengeance and love simultaneously. And I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. I was no longer simply a musician, a witness, a girl caught in his orbit. I was a part of the game now, and the rules were written in blood, loyalty, and fear. A game I didn't know if I wanted to play but couldn't walk away from even if I tried. I dressed quietly, choosing black again, my fingers brushing the fabric nervously. The cello case at my side feeling heavier than it ever had, as though the instrument itself understood that the music I played was no longer just music, but a weapon, a signal, a pulse that carried more than melody. It carried power, emotion, influence, and perhaps the only thing I could cling to in this life, a tether to something that still felt human, fragile, and alive. Dante was already in the music room when I arrived, the sunlight catching the angles of his face in a way that made him look almost vulnerable, though I knew better than to believe in that vulnerability for long. He didn't speak as I entered, didn't glance up immediately. He simply leaned against the piano, eyes closed, one hand drumming lightly against the polished wood, as if trying to measure the tension in the air and calculate whether it would be enough to keep us both alive. "You're late," he said finally, and even though it was just a statement, not an accusation, I felt a jolt of guilt run through me, twisting in my chest. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended, and I watched as his eyes opened slowly, sharp and piercing, assessing me in a way that left me both exposed and protected simultaneously. He stepped closer, and the air between us seemed to pulse with unspoken danger, unspoken desire, unspoken truths we hadn't yet dared to voice. "You're thinking about last night," he said, and I wanted to deny it, to claim composure, to tell him that I wasn't consumed by fear or fascination. But the words caught in my throat, because he was right. And he always seemed to be right when it mattered most. I whispered finally, letting the confession hang in the room, heavy and fragile and real. His jaw tightened, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his storm-colored eyes, and then he took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to cross a line that had existed for far too long. "Ilara," he said, his voice low, steady, intimate in a way that made my pulse quicken. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago, but I didn't know if you could handle it. And I didn't know if I could survive saying it aloud without losing control." My stomach tightened, and 1,000 questions rose unbidden to my lips. But I couldn't find a single one that felt safe or worthy, so I stayed silent, forcing myself to meet his gaze, to see the storm behind his eyes that had begun to feel like home, and yet also like a warning. "I never wanted you to be caught in this life," he continued, his hands moving almost imperceptibly as if testing the boundaries of the space between us. "But I knew the moment I met you that it was inevitable. You're not just a distraction, not just music. You're the only person I've ever trusted completely, the only person whose presence makes this chaos bearable, and the only person I would risk everything for." My heart stuttered at his words, fierce and fragile all at once, and I felt the familiar ache of desire tangled with fear, because the truth was undeniable. I wanted him in a way that terrified me, wanted him with every note I played and every breath I drew, and I could feel the dangerous gravity of our connection pressing down, constricting and liberating all at once. "Dante," I began, but the words failed me, because I didn't know how to say what I felt without revealing the fragility beneath my resolve, the part of me that had already surrendered to him in ways my mind refused to admit. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat of his body, until the tension in the room was a tangible pulse. And I realized that every moment, every touch, every glance between us was no longer about restraint. It was about inevitability, about surrender, about the dangerous truth that our lives were intertwined in ways we couldn't escape. "I should have told you sooner," he murmured, his hand brushing a loose strand of hair from my face. He hesitated, the weight of his confession making the space between us electric with unspoken promise and threat. "I've never wanted anyone like I want you. Not ever. And I don't just mean the music, I mean everything. But loving you means putting you in danger, and I don't know if I can bear the consequences if something happens to you." The words struck me harder than any threat, any bullet, any betrayal, because they were real, raw and human. And for the first time I saw the man beneath the legend, beneath the danger, beneath the cold, calculating exterior that had always defined him. He was human, he was vulnerable, and he was confessing everything to me with the risk of losing not just me, but himself in the act. "I'm not afraid," I whispered, though my voice quivered, and I could feel the trembling in my hands, the tremor in my chest, the way my pulse raced as I reached out to touch him, to anchor myself in the dangerous reality of him. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of losing you, of being left behind in a world I don't belong in without you." He stared at me, his eyes dark, stormy, and filled with something I couldn't name. A cocktail of fury, desire, love, and danger that made my knees weak. And then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the gap between us, his lips brushing mine just enough to set my nerves alight. And I realized that confession was no longer a conversation. It was an act of surrender, a collision, a promise, a risk we were taking together without knowing the cost. But just as the first shiver of relief settled into my bones, a sharp sound shattered the fragile bubble of intimacy. A noise that made both of us jump. The kind of sound that signaled intrusion, danger, immediacy. A footstep too deliberate, too heavy, echoing down the corridor outside the music room, followed by another and another. Dante stiffened, his hand gripping my wrist, his eyes scanning the shadows as though he could see the threat before it even arrived. The storm in his gaze, once full of confession and longing, turned to pure calculation, sharp and lethal. And I realized, with a pit that twisted in my stomach, that the moment of vulnerability, the moment of trust, had ended. "They found us," he whispered, low and dangerous, his body pressing close to mine, his presence a shield and a promise at once. "And this time, there will be no warning, no chance to run. We have to fight, Alara, or we die." And in that moment, as the shadows shifted outside the music room and the footsteps drew closer, I knew with a certainty that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time, that our world, the one we had begun to carve together with stolen kisses and whispered confessions and dangerous longing, was about to explode. That everything we had confessed, everything we had risked, everything we had loved, was on the verge of destruction, and that the next few minutes would decide whether we survived or were torn apart forever. The night was alive with chaos, and yet in the midst of it, the world had shrunk to the space between Dante and me, to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat that I could feel through the press of his body, to the intensity of his dark eyes burning into mine with a ferocity that made the blood in my veins sing and scream all at once. And in that moment, I understood with a clarity that frightened and exhilarated me that everything we had fought for, the music, the longing, the stolen kisses, the confessions, the betrayals, had led us here, to the edge of everything, where survival, love, and vengeance were all tangled in one inescapable truth. Either we endured it together, or we didn't endure at all. The footsteps outside the music room had multiplied into a storm of threats, shadows shifting across the walls like predators, and I could feel the tension coiling in Dante like a spring ready to snap, the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands flexed as he prepared for violence. And for a fleeting moment, I feared that I would lose him to the world that had always sought to claim him. And that fear was a weight I could barely carry, because I had already lost myself in him, willingly, irrevocably, and the thought of living without the storm that was Dante Moretti seemed more terrifying than the bullets, the betrayal, the chaos that now pressed against the doors of our sanctuary. He leaned close, his lips brushing my ear in a whisper that burned through the fear and adrenaline alike. "Stay behind me. Don't move unless I tell you. Trust me. Trust me with everything you have." I nodded, though my body trembled, not from fear alone, but from the raw, unshakable awareness that my life, my heart, my very soul had been handed over to him entirely, and that trust was now the only weapon I possessed against the madness that was encroaching from the shadows. He moved first, silent and deadly, each step calculated, each gesture precise, and I followed, keeping close enough to feel the warmth of him, the pulse of him, the tether that had become my lifeline, while the world outside pressed in like a living storm, threatening to sweep us apart before we had a chance to carve a space for ourselves in it. The first gunshot split the night, sharp, merciless, and I pressed myself against the piano as Dante moved to intercept the threat, his movements fluid, perfect, and terrifying, and I watched him with a mixture of awe and terror, knowing that the man who had confessed his love to me, who had kissed me with such desperate heat, was the same man who could end lives with the same ease and precision that he commanded the room. And I realized then that the danger I had been courting from the beginning was not just outside us, it was inextricably woven into the man I had chosen to love. Time slowed and accelerated all at once. Shadows leapt across the walls, flashes of gunfire illuminated the room in blinding bursts, and through it all, Dante moved with the certainty of someone who had danced with death countless times, whose loyalty was lethal, whose love was absolute. And I followed, my cello clutched in one hand, the other hand brushing his back as we wove through the chaos. Because it was no longer about survival alone. It was about the two of us, entwined in fire and music and blood, holding on to the only thing that had ever felt real. He caught the man who had betrayed him, the one who had sent the letter and set this night into motion. And I saw the storm in Dante's eyes flare to a hurricane, the quiet fury of a man who would destroy the world before letting harm touch the one he loved. And yet, as he paused, knife poised, gun ready, there was a flicker of restraint, almost imperceptible, a glimpse of the man beneath the monster. And in that pause, I realized that the fight was not just against the people who would see me dead, but against the parts of him that had learned to exist in darkness, and that loving him meant loving the storm and hoping it wouldn't consume us. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the chaos around us. Dante, stop! Don't let them change you. Don't let the blood be the end of us. He turned to me, his eyes wide, dark, and full of fire and fear and something else, something fragile, something human. Ilara, You have me, I said, my fingers brushing his jaw, my lips almost grazing his. And I have you. That's all that matters. Not them, not this night, not the ghosts we can't outrun. Something in him broke and healed all at once. The air between us vibrated with tension, with release, with unspoken promises. And for the first time in weeks, I saw him fully. Not as a Mafia boss, not as a storm, not as a man forged in shadows and blood, but as someone who had been capable of love. Fully, despite all the chaos, despite all the danger, despite everything the world had thrown at him. And I knew that he had been waiting for me, just as much as I had been waiting for him, in a quiet, desperate hope neither of us had dared to name. The final confrontation passed in a blur. Men neutralized, threats extinguished, the storm of violence giving way to a silence so complete it felt sacred. And Dante turned to me, his hands gripping my shoulders, his forehead resting against mine. And I could feel the tremor of his exhaustion, the release of the tension he had carried for weeks. And I understood in that shared heartbeat of quiet and danger that we had survived, not because the world had been kind, but because we had chosen each other. Because in the storm, we had found the tether, the pulse, the music that bound us beyond fear and blood and betrayal. We walked back through the remnants of the warehouse, the rain now falling gently, as if the city itself had exhaled, as if the storm outside mirrored the storm within and then released it all at once. And for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to feel the warmth of him beside me, to understand that whatever darkness remained in the world, whatever danger still lurked in shadows, we had something untouchable between us, something fierce, something unshakable, something that neither bullets nor betrayal could destroy. Back at the estate, I placed my cello by the window, watching the rain trace lines down the glass, and Dante came to stand behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. The heat of his body a reassurance and a promise that the night had confirmed. We were alive, together, and for now, that was enough. I thought I might lose you tonight, he murmured, voice rough with the residue of adrenaline and relief, and I felt the ache of the night in him, the weight of all he had carried. And yet, despite the darkness, despite the blood and the danger, there was something profoundly human in that confession, something that made me tremble with gratitude and love. You didn't, I said softly, leaning back into him, my fingers brushing his as I turned to look at him. And I'm not going anywhere, not tonight, not ever. He smiled, a small, dangerous, beautiful smile, and pressed a kiss to my temple, as if sealing a promise, as if making sacred the quiet life we would carve from chaos. And I realized then that survival wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about finding someone worth fighting through it all. Someone who makes the risk feel like life itself, and that in Dante Moretti, I had found that person, fierce and broken and perfect in ways that terrified me and delighted me in equal measure. Later, as I sat alone in the music room, bow in hand, I played a simple melody. Not for anyone, not for the world, but for the life we had fought to protect. For the tether that had held us through fire and betrayal. For the fragile, dangerous love that had become the center of my existence. And I understood, with a quiet certainty, that music had brought us together. But it was love, and the willingness to risk everything that had kept us alive. And as the final notes lingered in the air, soft and haunting, I realized that the world would always be dangerous, that storms would always come, that betrayal and loss were inevitable companions. But we had discovered a truth more powerful than fear, more enduring than violence, more alive than grief. That even in the darkest night, when shadows stretch long and threats loom near, love, once chosen and claimed, becomes a force that can carve a haven, a home, a pulse of light, even in the heart of chaos, and that we, together, would carry it forward, unbroken, unshaken, unafraid. And in that quiet, lingering moment, I knew we had survived. And we would survive again, because sometimes the fiercest storms leave behind the most enduring music.